Herzlich willkommen, liebe Zuschauer, zu einer weiteren Folge von Im Auge des Bruders mit Scott Ritter hier auf unserem YouTube-Kanal Gegenpol. Mein Name ist Monique Stegemann und in dieser Woche haben wir folgende Themen. Eskalation zwischen Aserbaidschan und Armenien. Welche Rolle spielen die USA dabei? Ein neuer Machtfaktor in Westafrika. Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger bilden eine Militärallianz. Außerdem, wann endet der Krieg in der Ukraine und wie könnte ein Friedensschluss aussehen? Hallo Scott, schön, dass du wieder da bist und dir die Zeit genommen hast. Wir schauen direkt auf die erste Frage, denn die Lage im Konflikt in Bergkarabach eskaliert erneut. Aserbaidschan hat unter dem Namen Anti-Terror-Maßnahmen militärische Aktionen eingeleitet. Armenien wendet sich an die USA und erbittet militärische Unterstützung. Im Hintergrund haben sich in den vergangenen Wochen dramatische geostrategische Veränderungen vollzogen. Obwohl Armenien OVKS-Mitglied ist und somit militärischer Alliierter Russlands, hat sich das Land offen von Moskau abgewandt und sucht die Nähe zu den USA. Jerewan und Washington planen sogar gemeinsame Militärübungen. Gleichzeitig hat sich Aserbaidschan diplomatisch Russland angenähert. Welche Auswirkungen haben diese Verschiebungen auf das Machtgefüge im Kaukasus und auf den Konflikt um Bergkarabach? Könnte die aktuelle Zuspitzung zu einem neuen Krieg zwischen Armenien und Aserbaidschan führen? Welche Folgen hätte das für Russland?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to understand that Armenia is in no position to fight a war against Azerbaijan. They performed abysmally in the 2020 Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. Their military has not improved since then. Azerbaijan's only gotten stronger. The second thing we need to point out is that as part of the consequences of their defeat in 2020, Armenia recognized and admits that Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijani territory, that the Republic of Artsakh is illegitimate, and that the Armenians who live in Nagorno-Karabakh are subject to Azerbaijani rule. Part of the deal was that any armed forces that were in Nagorno-Karabakh would be compelled to disarm or be removed. The Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh would be under the protection of Russian peacekeeping troops who deployed into the region. The decision by the Armenian government at the end of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War to basically surrender Nagorno-Karabakh to Azerbaijan was highly unpopular in Armenia, and it caused tremendous political unrest. And as a result, the Armenian government never fully implemented its requirement to disarm, to withdraw its troops from Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan apparently got tired of negotiating with Armenia, who was negotiating in bad faith. They tried a number of tactics, such as an economic embargo and things of that nature that didn't succeed. And so they carried out what they call an anti-terrorist operation. Whether or not that's an accurate term is something for politicians to debate over. But what is clear is that everybody agrees that what Azerbaijan is doing is an internal domestic problem for Azerbaijan, meaning that Nagorno-Karabakh is not Armenia. This is not a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and it shouldn't be painted as such. And that's the reality. You see the Armenian government tell their armed forces to stand down, do not engage with Azerbaijan, because they don't want a larger conflict, because they'll lose that conflict. And the danger is, if it becomes a larger conflict, Iran has said that they would step in on the side of Armenia, and Turkey has said they would step in on the side of Azerbaijan, and then you could have a larger conflict that involves two regional powers. Russia, would be compelled to do something, more than likely side with Armenia, and this could lead to a conflict between Russia and Turkey. Turkey is a NATO nation, so this is a very dangerous situation. It seems to have been resolved, though, as we speak. I think the Russians have negotiated a termination of the conflict. It has Armenia doing what it should have done all along, which is withdraw its forces to disarm. And the Azeri government will take full control of Nagorno-Karabakh. What does this portend for the future? Look, Armenia is in a very difficult situation, but it's one of its own making. Armenia was victorious in the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. They took 20% of Azeri territory. They were able to create a land bridge between Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. But they never negotiated in good faith afterwards to bring termination to the conflict. They believed that they had won the war, and therefore there was really nothing left for them to do. They treated the Russians abysmally. There's a very infamous situation where President Putin arrived in Armenia only to be left on the airfield, not greeted by Armenian officials. This level of disrespect is, there's a price to be paid. Armenia claims it doesn't need Russian support. Armenia claims it wants to lean towards the West, but now it finds itself isolated. Armenia needs to know this. It will never be a member of NATO. It doesn't qualify for NATO membership. It's not going to be a member of NATO. It's not going to be a member of the European Union. It's turned its back on its only true ally in the region, which is Russia. And so it's going to be isolated. I think by losing Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia is going to go through another very difficult political period. I think the current government will likely fall. Whatever replaces it, though, is going to have to deal realistically with the fact that the United States is not in a position to engage meaningfully in the Southern Caucasus, that the United States is not going to fulfill the hopes and expectations of Armenia. A military exercise does not automatically bring about a NATO invitation. And I think at some point in time, Armenia will have to go back to its foundational diplomatic roots and improve relations with Russia, restore relations with Russia, and realize that its future lies working within the Russian orbit, not trying to exit the Russian orbit.
Armeniens Ministerpräsident Nikol Pashinyan warnte jüngst vor einem Putschversuch gegen ihn und äußerte öffentlich, dass er sich von Russland allein gelassen fühle. Gleichzeitig versuchen die USA Armenien mit aller Macht an sich zu binden. Welche Pläne verfolgte Washington in Armenien und im Konflikt um Bergkarabach? Welche Rolle spielen die USA bei der aktuellen Eskalation?
Well, I think the United States right now is reacting to an evolving situation, looking for any opportunity it can find to isolate Russia, to weaken Russia. But Pashinyan is isolated because he is isolated himself. You can't claim to want to be a friend of Russia and then reach out to the United States, especially during these times. Does Pashinyan not understand, what the United States wants of him? They do not want to befriend Armenia. Keep in mind that the United States has spent a tremendous amount of effort trying to get Georgia to open up a second front against Russia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That has failed. The Georgian government has wisely said we don't want to have any part of that. So Armenia now is the next, is the next best thing. This situation that has evolved with Nagorno-Karabakh has provided the United States an opportunity to go in and stir up trouble, to see if they can get Armenia and Azerbaijan involved in a regional conflict that will draw Russia in, therefore weakening Russia's position regionally and vis-a-vis Ukraine. The end result, though, will be the destruction of Armenia, the literal destruction of Armenia, which should be the last thing any Armenian wants. Armenia will get nothing good out of a relationship with the United States. The United States will betray Armenia just like it's betrayed every other nation that it pretends to be friends with. Armenia only needs to look at Ukraine to understand what the future of Armenia is.
Schauen wir nach Afrika. Anfang der Woche gaben die Militärregierungen von Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger bekannt, dass sie eine militärische Allianz gründen wollen. Malis Interimspräsident Assimi Goïta machte deutlich, dass sich die Nationen zu einem Beistandspakt verpflichtet hätten. Ein Angriff auf einen dieser Staaten würde den Kriegseintritt der anderen auslösen. Welche Folgen hat dieser Schritt für die Ambitionen des Westens und der ECOWAS, den Putsch in Niger rückgängig zu machen? Plant der Westen überhaupt noch einen Krieg gegen Niger?
Well, I think what's happening is the West may be planning a conflict against Niger, but the West is unable to execute this conflict. ECOWAS is not a military power. Its strongest military member is Nigeria, and Nigeria is currently involved in a very difficult conflict with Boko Haram that has pretty much exceeded the Nigerian military capacity to wage conflict. To get to Niger, Nigeria would have to, basically fight its way through Boko Haram territory, and its lines of communication would be vulnerable to attack by Boko Haram. It would also probably lead to increased instability in the Lake Chad region, as Nigerian forces currently dedicated to that task would have to be diverted to what would undoubtedly become a expansive conflict with Nigeria, because it's not just against Nigeria, but it's also against Mali, also against Burkina Faso. France is hopeful that ECOWAS can accomplish this mission, and if not, maybe France can come to the assistance of ECOWAS, but France is in no position militarily to do anything more than evacuate Niger. France lacks the capacity to meaningfully reinforce its military position in the region, and it has insufficient troops in Niger to be able to tip the scales in favor of ECOWAS, especially if forces from Mali and Burkina Faso likewise get engaged. What we're seeing here is the collapse of France-Afrique, the neo-colonial reality that France imposed on Africa as it shed itself of its colonies. But all it did is shed itself of the term colonist. It became a neo-colonist. It became a nation that continues to dominate the economy, the social life, the military, the politics of their former colonies by insisting that these nations maintain unfair, unbalanced relations with France. This day and age is over. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. I think we're seeing Africa, at least West Africa, part of the Sahel, where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are, stand up on their own 2 feet and declare their independence. And there's really nothing that the West can do.
Die Bildung einer Militärallianz zwischen Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger ist ein Novum in der jüngeren Geschichte Afrikas. Wie wird es sich auf das politische Gefüge Afrikas auswirken? Welche geopolitischen Folgen hat es und könnte es andere Nationen Afrikas inspirieren, das Gleiche zu tun?
Absolutely. Look, organizations like ECOWAS, and there's other similar structures in Africa, are basically Western-dominated constructs designed to subordinate Africa to Western interests. What Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have done is declare independence from this Western dominance. And, one of the things that is manifested from this independence is an insistence that the West pay fair market value for the products produced by these nations. To give you an example, in Niger, instead of paying 80 cents per kilo of uranium, Niger's demanding now that France pay $2 per kilo, which is the market rate. And I think Burkina Faso is looking at not only exporting materials, but bringing in factories to turn these materials into finished products, therefore increasing the economic viability of these products so that there's employment, there's good jobs, there's industry, there's more income derived, because selling a finished product, you can charge more than selling a raw product. And I think this is the model that is going to be set for the rest of Africa, to shed themselves of being nothing more than, modern day slaves, modern day colonists of the United States, of Europe, of other nations that seek the economic exploitation of Africa. And so, yes, I do believe that this model will be drawn upon by other African nations who will seek to reaffirm their political independence from Europe, but more importantly, to assert their economic military independence from Europe.
Aber wird der Westen Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger einfach so vollständig unabhängig von ihm werden lassen? Was wird Frankreich, was werden die USA tun, um den Rest Afrikas davon abzuhalten, das Beispiel von Mali, Burkina Faso und Niger zu kopieren?
Well, I mean, ideally speaking, the United States would embark on genuine diplomacy and learn how to sit down and listen to nations with respect and to absorb what they have heard and formulate new policies that are respectful of the needs and wants and desires of these African states. But that's not how the United States works. We sit down and we seek to impose our viewpoint on them through economic force, through military pressure, through diplomatic isolation, threats of diplomatic isolation. France has done the same thing. Until Europe and the United States learn to treat Africa as equals, they will find themselves on the outside looking in. And at this juncture, as I already pointed out, France is in no position to engage in a large-scale conflict in Africa. They lack military capacity to do so. They would need the backing of the United States, but the United States is not about to begin a conflict that will require the diversion of military resources that the United States needs to be available for the ongoing crisis in Europe, any future crisis in the Pacific, any potential crisis or conflict in the Middle East. We just can't afford to have a fourth major zone of crisis. And so I think what we're going to see is that the United States and Europe are going to be squeezed out of Africa.
Blicken wir auf die Ukraine. Anfang der Woche schloss der ukrainische Präsident Wladimir Zelensky erneut aus, dass sein Land irgendwelche territorialen Zugeständnisse gegenüber Russland machen werde. Gleichzeitig ließ der ukrainische Geheimdienstchef Kirill Budanov im Interview mit Westmedien durchblicken, dass es wohl keinen Siegfrieden für die Ukraine geben werde. Nicht nur unsere Zuschauer fragen sich daher, wie und wann kann dieser Krieg in der Ukraine zu einem Ende kommen? Welches Szenario für Friedensgespräche siehst du? Kann es überhaupt Verhandlungen unter Beteiligung der Regierung Zelenskys geben?
First of all, only the Russian government can answer these questions definitively, because this is a political problem for Russia. But looking at Russian statements, looking at Russian actions, I think it's safe to say that Russia is not going to return any territories to Ukraine. That's a non-starter. So as long as Ukraine insists on this being a precondition for negotiations, there will be no negotiations. First of all, who needs this negotiation more? Ukraine, which is losing, and which, if it continues this fight, will lose even more, or Russia, who is winning. And if they continue this fight, will win even more. There's no pressure on Russia to end this war in a manner which does not provide Russia with the solutions it wants. It insists that Ukraine will never be part of NATO. So Ukraine will have to agree that they will never be part of NATO. It insists that NATO will have no meaningful engagement with Ukraine in a post-conflict environment. That means that all of this military assistance that's been provided to Ukraine must be erased, either turned over to Russia, destroyed, or returned to Europe. It can't remain in Ukraine. And the longer this conflict goes on, the more unlikely it is that Russia is going to allow any post-conflict Ukrainian government to continue to be manifested in a way that breathes life into the ideology of Stepan Bandera, the Banderist movement, the Right Sector, Sloboda, these Nazi organizations that have dominated modern-day Ukrainian politics. So Russia's not going to negotiate. If this conflict ends, it will be an unconditional surrender on the part of Ukraine. Unconditional. Ukraine won't have a vote. The only option Ukraine will have is to surrender or die. That's the sad state of affairs. And And I think Russia is not about to allow this to become a frozen conflict. That seems to be the next new buzz term being used in the West because the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed to achieve its objectives. Now they're talking about extending this conflict, creating a frozen conflict. A frozen conflict doesn't serve the interests of Russia as well. So remember, a frozen conflict, in order to be frozen, both sides have to agree to be frozen, to freeze. Russia's red hot. They're not about to freeze. They're going to continue to put all the pressure on Ukraine necessary to achieve the defeat of the Ukrainian military and the collapse of the Ukrainian political will to continue this conflict. We already see in the West that the West is starting to get tired of Ukraine. In the United States, there's a real movement in Congress to stop all funding for the Ukrainian conflict. Zelensky is not being greeted with open arms this time. In the United Nations, people are just refusing to meet with Zelensky. Poland is starting to turn its back on Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. And we're going to see this more and more and more as the Ukrainian government becomes more desperate and makes more demands of its allies for more money, more equipment, more commitment. You're going to see people saying enough is enough, we're tired of this. And at that juncture, Ukraine will be facing total collapse. And at that time, they may very well come crawling to the table to accept the unconditional terms of surrender that Russia will demand of them.
Schaut man auf die öffentlichen Äußerungen der NATO, dann sieht man Durchhalteparolen in Richtung Kiew und Bekundungen, die Ukraine bis zum Sieg weiter zu unterstützen. So gab der NATO-Admiral Rob Bauer zum Besten, dass die Ukraine Russland letztlich besiegen werde. Ist die NATO tatsächlich noch davon überzeugt, dass Kiew diesen Krieg gewinnen kann? Oder sind das nur publikumswirksame Äußerungen? Welche Rolle spielt die NATO für einen Frieden in der Ukraine?
NATO has no role in bringing peace to Ukraine. NATO has only brought war to Ukraine, and NATO will continue to bring war to Ukraine. NATO is responsible for the destruction of Ukraine. NATO is responsible for the deaths of every single Ukrainian soldier that's died on this battle. NATO is responsible for every homeless mother and child. NATO is responsible for every destroyed home, every destroyed electrical generation station. NATO is responsible for the death of Ukraine. NATO is a despicable organization that should be disbanded immediately. General Bauer should probably be prosecuted as a war criminal for promoting these things, but he won't be. Reality is he won't be. But he's an idiot. He's not a general. He's a politician. He's making political statements. No general would make that statement that he's made. No military commander would make the statement he's made. What general orders others to go die for a cause that he's promoting? He's not a general. He's a coward, just like the rest of the German government, just like the chancellor of Germany, just like the foreign minister of Germany. Idiots who've been promoted well above their pay grade and are responsible for the destruction of a nation, not only their own nation, economically, morally, physically. What is Germany today? Not much. But Ukraine, at least Germany's alive. Pathetically so, but it's alive. Ukraine is dying, it's dead. And it's because of people like Bauer, because of nations like Germany, because of organizations like NATO. NATO doesn't play any positive role whatsoever, 100% negative. And there's not a damn thing NATO can do to stop Russian victory. And this is the ultimate irony of General Bauer's statement, because NATO, through its ridiculous Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, has used rhetoric to back itself into a corner, talking about the existential nature of the struggle with Russia. Russia never threatened NATO at all, not once. It's NATO that threatened Russia. And now that it's boomerang back on them, NATO is reflecting on the fact that they are going to lose in Ukraine, that nothing NATO can do will resolve this issue. Moreover, as Russia emerges from the post-Ukrainian conflict stronger than ever before, NATO will not be able to live up to the rhetoric that it put on the table with Vilnius, 300,000 strong rapid response force. What a joke. NATO can't afford it. They can't sustain it. They'll never be able to build it. That's the reality. NATO is an organization that has long since passed its usefulness. And I think as this conflict reaches its tragic end, the world, including Europe, is going to recognize that NATO is the problem, not the solution. The best thing to do is find a way to get rid of it as quick as possible.
Eine letzte Frage. Die USA haben angekündigt, dass die amerikanischen M1 Abrams-Kampfpanzer bald in der Ukraine eintreffen werden. Tatsächlich wartet die Ukraine schon lange darauf. Werden die USA die Abrams-Kampfpanzer liefern oder verschieben sie die Lieferung immer weiter? Worauf warten Sie?
These are questions only the United States can answer. They've articulated that they want to provide 31 M1 Abrams tanks, maybe more in the future, to Ukraine. This is about a battalion's worth of tanks. These are not top-notch tanks. These are refurbished tanks. These are tanks that have been given armor that is not capable of stopping anything the Russians are going to throw at it. These are tanks that are very difficult to maintain. The Ukrainians can't maintain them. They're tanks that are too heavy for the terrain in Ukraine, so they'll get bogged down. I mean, why would you give Ukraine such a heavy tank in the middle of the the muddy season? You're inviting the M1 Abrams to get bogged down in the mud and be destroyed by Russian loitering munitions. Whatever Ukrainian soldiers are used to man these tanks will die. That's the tragic reality. These tanks will not have any impact on the battlefield. So if I were an American, I would seek to delay the provision of these tanks as long as possible in hopes that you somehow, cajole Ukraine into accepting termination of this conflict. That's not going to happen. So at some point in time, these tanks will show up on the battlefield where they will be destroyed. The Ukrainian crew members will die, be wounded, crippled, burned, captured if they're lucky. And in the United States, we'll be left to reflect on, the failure of its overall policy. And the world will be left to reflect on the inadequacies of the M1 Abrams tank.
Vielen Dank, Scott, für das interessante Interview und deine aufschlussreichen Analysen. Wir freuen uns auf nächste Woche.
Okay, thanks. Have a good day.
Dankeschön. Tschüss. Meine lieben Zuschauer, auch an euch herzlichen Dank fürs Zusehen. Wenn euch das Video gefallen hat, dann teilt es doch bitte breit in den sozialen Medien, abonniert eben noch unseren Kanal Gegenpol und vor allem, wenn ihr mal Fragen habt, die wir Scott Ritter stellen sollen, dann schreibt sie uns doch in die Kommentare. Wir freuen uns auf euch. Bis nächste Woche, eure Monique.